In the autumn of 613, near the village of Renève, in what is now eastern France, an elderly woman in royal robes stood before a jeering army. At nearly 80 years old, she had ruled kingdoms for nearly half a century. Now, bound and defenseless, Queen Brunhilda of Austrasia faced 3 days of state-sanctioned torture, followed by one of the most horrifying executions ever inflicted upon European royalty. Her crime, according to her captors, was responsibility for the deaths of 10 Frankish kings. Her real transgression was wielding power in a world that refused to forgive ambitious women. Queen Brunhilda, captured after civil war. When King Chlothar II of Burgundy died from dysentery at 27 in 613, Brunhilda elevated his 11-year-old son Sigebert II to rule both Austrasia and Burgundy. This decision sealed her fate. The nobility had endured her iron rule for decades. She had executed dukes who opposed her and accumulated powerful enemies. When she ordered the assassination of Bishop Desiderius of Vienne in 612, even the church turned against her. Chief among her enemies was Chlothar II of Neustria, son of Fredegund. The woman Brunhilda held responsible for her sister's murder and her husband's assassination nearly 4 decades earlier. The betrayal began with Warnachar and Rado, who secretly allied with Chlothar against the Queen Regent. When Brunhilda marched to meet Chlothar's army at the Ain River, the patrician Alethius, Duke Rocco, and Duke Sigvold deserted her before battle began. Her army refused to fight. She fled with Sigebert and his brother Corbo towards Switzerland, hoping to reach the Germanic tribes. But Chlothar's soldiers pursued relentlessly. At Lake Neuchâtel, they were captured. The young kings were executed immediately. Only the infant Merovingian was spared. Brunhilda was brought to Renève, where before the assembled forces, the queen who had ruled for 50 years would face judgment. Public condemnation and accusations by Chlothar II. The trial was political theatre designed to justify the punishment Chlothar had already determined. Standing before the assembled army, the nearly 80-year-old queen faced accusations that stretched credibility even in the brutal world of Merovingian politics. Chlothar II accused Brunhilda of responsibility for the deaths of 10 Frankish kings. The list included her own husband, Sigebert I, assassinated by Fredegund's hired killers in 575. The accusation was grotesque in its dishonesty. Brunhilda had loved Sigebert, and his murder had launched her decades-long quest for vengeance. He blamed her for Chilperic I, his own father, mysteriously stabbed to death in 584. He accused her of the deaths of her grandsons Theudebert II and Theuderic II, ignoring their civil war. He claimed she orchestrated the death of Merovingian, conveniently ignoring that Merovingian had been her second husband. The murder of Bishop Desiderius was indeed her doing, but it was only one among a fabricated litany, some occurring before she could possibly have been involved. The charges painted her as a monster who had used murder and treachery across 5 decades. Some held fragments of truth. She had ordered executions, including that of Duke Unkellen, whom she had killed under harsh interrogation. But the wholesale attribution of every violent death to her was a calculated lie. The accusations served clear purpose. By branding her responsible for the chaos, Chlothar transformed his brutal treatment of an elderly captive into justice. He positioned himself as an avenger. The army cheered. The medieval sources revealed deep misogyny. While Merovingian kings routinely murdered rivals without facing moral condemnation, Brunhilda's similar actions were portrayed as unnatural. Her crime was not merely what she had done, but that she had dared to do it while female, wielding power that Frankish law reserved for men. Standing before her accusers, Brunhilda offered no defense that has survived. The sentence was pronounced, and with it began 3 days that would cement her execution as one of the most brutal in recorded history. 3 days of state-sanctioned torture. What followed was a prolonged ritual of humiliation and agony that lasted 3 full days. The army that had abandoned Brunhilda at the Ain River now gathered to witness her suffering. The tortures served multiple purposes: satisfying soldiers who had feared her power, demonstrating Chlothar's triumph, and sending an unmistakable message to any noble who might question the new order. The historical sources are clear about the duration but less specific about the exact tortures inflicted. What we know with certainty is that Brunhilda, at nearly 80 years old, endured physical torments designed to break her body and spirit. Her bones had grown brittle, her flesh thin, and her body no longer possessed the resilience of youth. Yet the tortures were calibrated to keep her alive and suffering for the full 3 days Chlothar had decreed. The psychological dimension was equally calculated. Brunhilda had spent nearly half a century as a figure of authority, commanding armies, appointing bishops, determining the fates of kingdoms. Now she was rendered completely powerless, her royal dignity stripped away, subjected to the will of men who had once feared her gaze. The reversal was total and deliberate. The centerpiece of her public humiliation came when she was bound to a camel and paraded through the assembled army. The Liber Historiae Francorum specifically records this detail. The choice of a camel was deeply symbolic. These exotic beasts from distant lands were unfamiliar to Frankish soldiers. The camel's awkward gait, lurching and uncomfortable, made Brunhilda's ride a physical ordeal, constantly jarring her already battered body. Mounted high on the animal's back, Brunhilda was visible to the entire encampment. Thousands could witness her degradation. As the camel was led through the ranks, soldiers jeered and mocked her. They shouted insults, they laughed at her helplessness, they celebrated her downfall. Men who had served under commanders she appointed now felt free to express their contempt openly. Some soldiers may have thrown refuse at her, others may have spat in her direction as she passed. The mockery was relentless, wave after wave of humiliation washing over the elderly queen. The mockery was orchestrated and encouraged. Chlothar needed his army to see Brunhilda not as a captured queen deserving respect, but as a criminal receiving just punishment. Every jeer, every mocking laugh reinforced the narrative that her execution was justice rather than political murder. The soldiers became participants in her destruction, complicit in the spectacle, bound by that complicity to Chlothar's new regime. Between these degrading processions, she was kept in confinement that the sources do not detail. But we can imagine the conditions. Cold autumn nights without adequate shelter, minimal food and water, wounds left untreated. Every hour that passed added to her physical deterioration. Sleep would have been impossible, both from pain and from the knowledge of what awaited her. The nights must have stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of the camp around her, the laughter and conversations of soldiers, the normalcy of their routines, a stark contrast to her own impending doom. The historical sources suggest she remained conscious throughout much of this ordeal. Her torturers were skilled enough to inflict maximum suffering without allowing her the mercy of unconsciousness or death. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect, that she was forced to experience and remember every moment of her degradation, unable to escape into oblivion. As the 3rd day drew to a close, Brunhilda had survived torments that would have killed many younger prisoners. Her body was broken, her spirit tested beyond imagining. Yet she still lived, and Chlothar had reserved for her a final act of brutality that would ensure her death became one of the most horrifying executions in European history. Execution by being dragged behind a horse. On the 4th day, as the autumn sun rose over Renève, the torture ended and the execution began. She would be dragged to death behind a wild horse, her body destroyed by the very ground she had once ruled. This execution method, known as fatal dragging by equine force, had ancient precedents, but remained shocking even in the brutal context of Merovingian justice. Brunhilda was brought before the assembled army one final time. Her body, already ravaged by 3 days of torture, was prepared for execution. According to multiple historical accounts, she was secured by her hair, one arm and one leg to the tail of an unbroken horse. Some sources indicate bindings were also attached to her wrists and ankles, ensuring her entire body would suffer the tearing force. The horse itself was deliberately chosen. Not a trained war horse, but a wild animal, powerful and unpredictable. When the horse was released, it bolted immediately. The terror of confinement, the unfamiliar weight dragging behind, the shouts of soldiers, all drove the animal into panicked gallop. Brunhilda's body was instantly pulled across rough ground. The initial jolt alone would have caused tremendous damage to her already weakened frame, causing severe injuries to her joints and muscles, beginning the fatal trauma that would end her life. As the horse ran, her body was violently dragged over terrain studded with rocks, roots, and uneven earth. The bindings held firm, expertly tied to ensure they would not break. This was deliberate. The executioners had crafted them specifically to ensure Brunhilda's body would remain attached for as long as possible, prolonging her agony. The Chronicle of Fredegar notes that her body was catastrophically damaged as the horse careened through the camp. The constant jarring and pulling began to literally cause fatal injuries throughout her body. The execution was prolonged. The horse covered significant distance before Brunhilda's ravaged form finally ceased showing signs of life. When the horse was caught and brought to a halt, what remained was barely recognizable. But even this was not the end. The Liber Historiae Francorum records that her final grave was fire itself. Her broken remains were gathered and burned, her remains reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. This ensured no shrine could be built to her memory, no grave that might become a rallying point. Even physical remains that might have been buried with honor were eliminated. Brunhilda's execution marked the end of civil wars that had torn Francia apart for nearly half a century. Chlothar II became the first king to unite all the Frankish kingdoms since 561. The reunification came at the cost of extraordinary violence, and Brunhilda's broken body became the foundation upon which he...
Sire, the enemy is at our gates!
Then we march! Warriors to arms!